Good evening. Turn off the lights. Put in your earbuds. The stories we tell tonight are not for the light of day. We're traveling to the ancient shadow-filled mountains of Appalachia, where the deepest horror isn't a ghost. It's the secrets people keep. If you enjoy the tales that follow, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Now, listen closely. The woods are calling. My name is Maya. I'm a cartographer. I map the world, reducing its chaos to the clean, predictable logic of contour lines and elevation markers. After my husband, Ben, died in a climbing accident, my own world lost its logic. The maps of my life were torn to shreds, so I did the only thing that made sense to me. I went to the one place that was already mapped, a single continuous line stretching from Georgia to Maine. I went to the Appalachian Trail. I thought a solo through hike, a journey of 2,000 miles, would give me the time and the solitude to redraw my own map, to find a new path forward. I thought the trail would heal me. I was wrong. The trail was just hungry. I started in the spring, moving north with the season. The first few weeks were a blur of physical pain and emotional numbness. But as my body hardened, my mind began to quiet. The rhythm of the trail, walk, eat, sleep, repeat, became a kind of meditation. The oppressive humidity of the Georgia mountains, the chorus of cicadas, the dense green tunnel of the forest. It was all-consuming. I was just another creature in the woods, a small, grieving animal moving through the ancient rolling mountains. The first sign of wrongness came in the Great Smoky Mountains. It was the blazes, the iconic white rectangles painted on the trees, the thru-hiker's lifeline. They seemed different. I'd been hiking for over a month, and the sight of a blaze was as familiar as my own reflection. But these had a strange quality. In the deep shade of the old-growth forest, they seemed to have a faint internal luminescence. When I touched one, its surface wasn't the dry, chalky texture of old paint. It was slightly damp, almost sticky, with a texture like hardened sap. I scraped a tiny piece off with my fingernail. It was pliable, almost fleshy. I dismissed it as a strange type of paint used by the Park Service, or maybe a trick of the light and my own exhaustion. The mind does strange things when you're alone in the woods for that long. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I started paying closer attention. At dusk, the blazes would pulse with a soft, milky white light, a slow, rhythmic beat like a sleeping heart. During a rainstorm, I saw one seem to bleed. A thin, clear, viscous fluid oozed from its surface, smelling faintly of ozone and something sweet, like rotting honey. This wasn't paint. This was something alive. I tried to rationalize it. A bioluminescent fungus? A strange species of lichen? My cartographer's brain desperately sought a logical classification. But my gut, the primal animal part of me, knew this was something else. The trail wasn't just a path. It was a living system, and the blazes were its eyes, watching me, guiding me, leading me deeper into its gut. The first time I met the other hikers, I was relieved. I had been alone for days, and the strangeness of the blazes was starting to wear on my sanity. I found them at a shelter just south of the Rhone Highlands, a group of 3 thru-hikers sitting silently around a cold fire pit. They were unnervingly still. "Hey there," I said, dropping my pack. "Mind if I join you?" They all turned to look at me at the same time, their movements perfectly synchronized. Their eyes were glazed, unfocused, like the eyes of people in a deep trance. "Welcome," one of them said, his voice a flat, emotionless monotone. "The path has brought you to us." The other 2 nodded in unison. "The path provides," the woman next to him said in the exact same flat tone. A cold dread washed over me. This wasn't the easy camaraderie of the trail. This was something else. I noticed they were all staring not at me, but at the white blaze on the tree behind me. Their expressions were ones of placid, bovine adoration. "Are you guys okay?" I asked, my hand moving instinctively towards the bear spray on my hip. "We are of the path," the third hiker said. "We follow the blazes. We trust the path. The path is all." That's when I saw it. A small, white, root-like tendril no thicker than a piece of thread was creeping out of the ear of the first hiker. It pulsed with the same faint, milky light as the blazes on the trees. I looked at the others. They had them too. Thin white filaments extending from their ears and nostrils, their ends twitching slightly in the air as if tasting it. My blood ran cold. The blaze moss, or whatever it was, wasn't just on the trees, it was in them. It was a parasite, and these hikers were its hosts. They were no longer people. They were puppets, animated by the will of the trail itself. I backed away slowly. I think I'm going to push on to the next shelter," I stammered. Their heads all turned to follow me, their movements still perfectly synchronized. "You cannot leave the path," the woman said, her voice a hollow echo. "The path is safe. The path is all. Follow the blazes." I didn't answer. I just turned and ran, the sound of their three voices calling after me in a flat, emotionless chorus. "Trust the path. Trust the path." I hiked through the night, my headlamp cutting a frantic, bouncing path through the darkness. Every white blaze I saw on a tree now looked like a malevolent eye, watching me, judging me. The trail was no longer a path to healing. It was a digestive tract, and I was being slowly, methodically consumed. I knew I had to get off the trail. It was the only way. To leave the path was a cardinal sin for a through hiker, a recipe for getting lost and dying in the vast, trackless wilderness. But staying on the path was a death of a different kind, a slow erasure of the self. The next morning I made my choice. I found a spot where a small stream crossed the trail, and I stepped off the path into the dense, untracked forest. I was going to navigate by compass and map alone, to try and find my way to a road to civilization. I was going to redraw my own map. The forest immediately seemed to resist me. The undergrowth was a tangled, thorny mess of rhododendron and mountain laurel, a wall of green that tore at my clothes and my skin. The ground was a treacherous maze of moss-covered rocks and hidden roots. The air grew heavy, humid, and still. The normal sounds of the forest, the birds, the insects, the rustle of small animals died away, replaced by an oppressive, watchful silence. And then the voices started. They were faint at first, carried on the wind. The voices of the blazed. "Come back, Maya. The path is safe. You are lost. Come back to the path." They were hunting me. Not by chasing me, but by calling to me, using the promise of safety and familiarity as a lure. The trail itself was a predator, and it did not want to let its meal escape. I pushed on, ignoring the voices, my heart pounding with a terror that was more profound than any I had ever known. The forest grew darker, the trees pressing in, their branches like grasping skeletal fingers. I felt like I was being swallowed. I spent 2 days in that trackless wilderness, a living nightmare of fear, exhaustion, and constant whispering voices. The forest fought me every step of the way. I fell, twisting my ankle, my water filter clogged. A strange spreading rash appeared on my arms where the thorns had scratched me. The forest was not a neutral environment. It was an active participant in the hunt. It was the trail's immune system trying to destroy the foreign body that had left the designated path. On the 3rd day, I was on the verge of collapse. My ankle was swollen, I was out of water, and the voices were no longer just whispers. They were inside my head, a constant droning chorus. "Trust the path is all, surrender, join us." I stumbled into a small clearing and saw it. A single ancient oak tree, and on its trunk was a white blaze pulsing with a soft, welcoming light. The path. It had found me, or it had led me here. The blazed were waiting for me. The 3 from the shelter and a dozen more standing in a silent circle around the tree. Their eyes were glazed, their faces empty. The white, root-like tendrils had grown, covering their faces in a delicate, horrifying lattice. "You are home," one of them said, its voice the collective hum of the group. "The path has brought you home. It is time to settle. It is time to bleed." They advanced on me, their movements slow, deliberate, inevitable. I raised my bear spray, but I knew it was useless. This was the end of my trail, but as they reached for me, a different voice cut through the chorus in my head. Ben's voice, my husband's voice from a memory I thought I had buried. "When you're lost, Maya, don't follow the path. Follow the water. Water always leads out." The stream, the one I had followed away from the trail. I could hear it, just a faint trickle, somewhere behind me. With the last of my strength, I turned and ran, not away from them, but towards the sound of the water. I crashed through the undergrowth, the voices of the blazed rising in a shriek of angry, frustrated sound behind me. I followed the stream, scrambling over rocks, half falling, half swimming. It was my only map, my only hope. I don't know how long I followed it. Hours, a day. I lost all track of time. I just moved, driven by that single, desperate instinct. The stream became a creek, the creek became a river, and finally I saw it. A bridge, a road, the world of men. I was found by a fisherman collapsed on the side of a highway miles from the Appalachian Trail. I was dehydrated, hypothermic, and in a state of severe psychological shock. I told them my story. The police, the doctors, the park rangers. They all listened with the same patient, pitying smiles. A grieving widow alone in the woods suffering a psychotic break. It was a simple, logical explanation. They found my abandoned gear on the trail. They found no strange fungus, no other hikers, no evidence of anything I had described. My story was just that, a story. I live in a city now as far from the mountains as I can get. I'm a cartographer who is afraid of maps. I can't look at a trail on a map without feeling a phantom itch in my ears, without hearing the faint whispering chorus of the blazed. Trust the path. So if you ever find yourself on a long, lonely trail and you see the familiar white blaze on a tree, I want you to look closer. Touch it, see if it feels like paint. See if it feels warm. And if you meet other hikers whose eyes are a little too empty, whose voices are a little too flat, don't be polite. Don't stop to chat. Run. Get off the path. Follow the water. Because the trail is not your friend. It is not a path to enlightenment. It is a predator, and it is always, always hungry. My name is Zoya. I'm a landscape photographer. My passion isn't just capturing a pretty picture, it's capturing the feeling of a place, the weight of the silence, the texture of the light. I work with both digital and analog, a new high-resolution digital for its clarity, and an old 35mm film camera for its soul. Film, I believe, sees things the digital eye misses. It captures the ghost in the machine. I never knew how right I was. Last fall, my best friend Mark and I set out to hike a section of the Appalachian Trail through the Great Smoky Mountains. Mark is a pragmatist, an engineer who believes everything can be explained by physics and logic. He was the perfect counterbalance to my artistic sensibilities. He called my film camera a nostalgic paperweight. I called his obsession with GPS coordinates a lack of imagination. We were a good team. The Smokies in autumn are a place of profound, almost aggressive beauty. The air is sharp with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. The mountains roll on forever, their peaks often shrouded in the low-hanging, smoke-like fog that gives them their name. It's a place that feels ancient, a place where the world is still wild. We were a few days in, deep in a section known for its dense rhododendron tunnels when we met Alan. He was a through hiker, one of those lean, weathered figures who seem more a part of the trail than a visitor to it. He had the quiet confidence of someone who had walked over 1,000 miles and seen it all. He decided to hike with us for a few days, and we were glad for the company. He had stories, a deep knowledge of the trail, and a calming presence. The first sign of wrongness was a sound, or rather the lack of one. We were camped in a deep holler, a valley so enclosed by the mountains that the air felt heavy and still. The usual nighttime chorus of crickets and katydids was absent. The forest was utterly unnaturally silent. Alan noticed it too. "This is a quiet spot," he'd said, his eyes scanning the dark tree line. "Too quiet." Mark just shrugged it off. "Temperature drop," he'd said. "Insects are probably dormant." Logic. Always logic. That night I couldn't shake the feeling that the silence wasn't empty. It was listening. The next day I was taking photos of a massive ancient oak tree, its branches twisted like arthritic fingers. I took a shot with my digital camera, then one with my film camera. As I lowered the camera, I felt a sudden, intense chill, a drop in temperature so localized it was like stepping into a walk-in freezer. The feeling passed as quickly as it came. Mark, who was a few yards away, didn't feel a thing. "Probably just a weird air current," he said. But Alan looked at me, his expression serious. "The mountains breathe," he whispered. "Sometimes they breathe out something cold." That evening back at camp, I was reviewing the day's shots on my digital camera's small screen. I had the photo of the oak tree. It was a good shot, the light filtering through the canopy perfectly. I zoomed in to check the focus, and my heart stopped. Standing just behind the trunk of the oak tree, partially obscured, was a figure. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its joints bent at angles that were subtly, sickeningly wrong. It had no discernible features, no face, no clothes. Just a smooth, pale, vaguely humanoid shape, like a mannequin made of stretched skin. It was looking directly at the camera, directly at me. "Mark," I whispered, my voice trembling, "look at this." I showed him the screen. He frowned, squinting. "Look at what? It's a tree." "No, behind it. There's a man." He took the camera, zoomed in, and then looked back at me with a mixture of pity and concern. "Zoya, there's nothing there. It's just a trick of the light. The way the shadows are falling on the bark. You're just tired." I snatched the camera back, my hands shaking. I knew what I had seen. It was there. But when I looked at the screen again, he was right. There was nothing. Just the tree, the shadows, the light. I must have imagined it. I had to have imagined it. The next day, my unease was a constant companion. I kept seeing flickers of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that seemed to detach themselves from the trees and then melt away when I turned to look. Mark was starting to get annoyed with my jumpiness. Alan, however, was quiet and watchful. He'd seen my face the night before. He knew I wasn't just tired. We stopped for lunch at a scenic overlook, a rocky outcrop with a stunning view of the rolling blue-tinged mountains. I asked Mark and Alan to pose for a photo. I took one with my digital camera. They were smiling, the vast, beautiful landscape behind them. Then I took a second shot with my old film camera. That night, the feeling of being watched was more intense than ever. I felt like a specimen under a microscope, 1,000 unseen eyes on me from the impenetrable darkness of the forest. I barely slept. The next day, we hiked to a road crossing where we had arranged for a supply drop. While we waited, I pulled out my laptop and a portable card reader. I had to know. I had to see the digital photos on a larger screen. I loaded the images from the overlook. The first photo was perfect. Mark and Alan smiling, the mountains stretching out behind them. Then I opened the second photo, taken just a second later. My breath caught in my throat. It was there, standing between Mark and Alan, its long, pale arms draped casually over their shoulders. It was tall, its featureless head looming over theirs. It was smiling, a wide, lipless grin that was just a dark gash in its smooth face. And it was looking right at me. Mark and Alan were still smiling in the photo, completely unaware of the thing that was holding them. "Pareidolia," Mark said immediately, peering at the screen. "It's a smudge on the lens, or a weird reflection. Your brain is creating a pattern that isn't there." But Alan was silent. He stared at the photo, his face pale. He had been on the trail for 4 months. He had heard the stories. He leaned in close to the screen, his eyes tracing the impossible angles of the creature's limbs. "I've seen it before," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "In other people's photos, they call it the photo bomber, the man in the background. They say it's a glitch, a digital artifact." He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a fear that mirrored my own. "But it's not a glitch, is it?" The horror wasn't just that the creature was real, it was that it was selective. It chose who could see it. It had appeared on my digital camera, but only I could see it. Mark's logical, skeptical mind literally could not perceive it. The creature existed in a space between perception and reality, and it was using my camera as a doorway. That night, the atmosphere at our campsite was thick with a tension that was almost unbearable. Mark was angry, convinced I was having a breakdown. Alan was terrified, performing small, ritualistic checks of the campsite perimeter, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness. I was caught in the middle, armed with a truth that only one other person could see. I decided to conduct an experiment. I set up my film camera on a small tripod, pointing it at our tent. I used the self-timer to take a picture every 10 minutes throughout the night. I didn't know what I was looking for. I just knew I had to see what the film saw. The next day, we hiked into the nearest trail town to resupply, and for me, to find a place that could develop my film. The small, touristy town felt like a different planet after the oppressive silence of the woods. I found a small camera shop run by an old man with kind, watery eyes. I gave him the roll of film. "Can you develop this for me? Rush job," I said, my voice tight. He gave me a long, sad look. "Hiking the trail, are you?" he asked. I nodded. He sighed. "I get a lot of you folks in here, always in a hurry, always looking for something on your film." He took the roll. "Come back in an hour." When I returned, the old man had the prints in a thick envelope. He didn't meet my eyes. "Sometimes," he said softly, "it's better not to look at the pictures. Some things are better left unseen." I took the envelope with trembling hands and walked out of the shop. I sat on a park bench, the sounds of the town a distant, meaningless hum. I opened the envelope. The first few photos were of the campsite, empty and still in the moonlight. Then came the photos from the middle of the night. The creature was in every one. In the first, it was standing at the edge of the woods, a tall, pale shape in the darkness. In the next, it was closer, standing just behind Mark's side of the tent. In the next, it was peering into the tent's mesh window, its featureless face pressed against the screen. And then the last photo. It was a picture of me, asleep in my sleeping bag. The photo was taken from inside my tent. The creature was crouched over me, its long, slender fingers just inches from my face. And it was holding my film camera, its dark, lipless grin reflected in the lens. It hadn't just been outside. It had come in. It had used my own camera to take a picture of me, a souvenir. I screamed. I dropped the photos and scrambled back, my mind shattering. It was real. It had been in my tent. It had been watching me sleep. Mark and Alan came running. Mark saw the photos scattered on the ground, saw the look on my face, and his skepticism finally broke. The color drained from his face. Alan just knelt and gathered the photos, his expression one of grim, terrible confirmation. "We have to go," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We have to get off the trail, now." We didn't go back. We left our gear, our plans, our entire through hike behind. We got in a rental car and drove, not stopping until we were back in the concrete and steel embrace of the city. The official story is that I had a psychotic break. The photos? A clever, elaborate hoax, a product of my grief-stricken artistic mind. Mark, trying to protect me, went along with the story. Alan just disappeared. He finished his hike and no one has heard from him since. I check the hiker forums sometimes. A few months ago, a young woman posted a photo from the Smokies. A beautiful shot of a waterfall. In the comments, someone had written, "Is that a person in the background?" I looked. It was just a trick of the light, a shadow on the rocks. But I know what she saw. I don't take pictures anymore. My cameras are packed away in a box in my basement. I can't look through a lens without seeing that featureless face, that dark, smiling gash. The horror of the trail isn't the isolation or the physical danger. It's the knowledge that there are things in this world that exist just outside our perception. Things that can only be seen through the cold, impartial eye of a camera. They are the static in the signal, the ghost in the machine. They are always in the background, just behind you, smiling. So if you're ever out in the deep woods and you take a picture of a beautiful landscape and you get the feeling that the photo is not quite right, that there's something in the frame that you can't quite see, trust that feeling. Don't zoom in, don't enhance, delete the photo, burn the negative. Because some things once seen can never be unseen, and they have a way of following you home. My name is Albert Tyler. I'm a cognitive psychologist, and my field of study is the effect of extreme isolation on the human mind. I've spent my career analyzing the journals of shipwrecked sailors, the logs of solo polar explorers, and the testimonies of astronauts. I believed with academic certainty that every ghost, every phantom, every monster encountered in solitude was simply a hallucination. The brain, starved of stimulus, creating its own patterns, its own company. I saw the supernatural as a symptom of a lonely mind. To prove my thesis, I decided to become my own test subject. I planned a 30-day solo hike through the most remote section of the Shenandoah National Park, a place of deep hollers and ancient silent mountains. I went into those woods armed with logic, reason, and a profound, arrogant skepticism. I came out with none of the above. I began my journey in late autumn, when the trail was deserted and the vibrant colors of the forest had faded to a uniform, melancholy brown. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, a sweet, rotten perfume that clung to everything. The silence was immediate and absolute. It wasn't a peaceful silence, it was a heavy, watchful quiet. The mountains of Appalachia don't soar, they loom. They are old, worn down, and patient, and they make you feel like a fleeting, insignificant guest in a place that has seen empires rise and fall. For the first week, the experiment was a success. I documented my psychological state meticulously in my journal. Feelings of peace, heightened sensory awareness, a sense of connection to the natural world. I felt my city-frayed nerves begin to smooth out. The solitude was a balm. I was proving my own theory that a healthy, rational mind could withstand isolation without fracturing. The first sighting occurred on day 8. I was camped on a high ridge, watching the thick valley fog roll in below me like a slow-motion, ghostly tide. I was scanning the opposite ridge with my binoculars when I saw him. He was standing at the edge of a clearing about half a mile away. A man. He was too far to make out details, but his posture was strange, unnaturally still like a poorly made statue. And he was looking directly at me. I waved, a friendly gesture from one solitary hiker to another. He didn't wave back. He just stood there. I focused the binoculars, trying to get a clearer look, and then I saw his face, or rather his grin. Even from that distance, it was unmistakable. A wide, fixed, impossibly broad smile. It was a grin of pure, ecstatic, and utterly reasonless joy. It was the most disturbing thing I had ever seen. I watched him for nearly an hour, my scientific curiosity warring with a primal growing dread. He never moved. He just stood there, a black silhouette against the gray sky, grinning. As dusk fell and he was swallowed by the shadows, I told myself what my research had taught me. It was a trick of the light. It was pareidolia, my brain creating a familiar pattern, a face, out of the random shapes of trees and rocks. It was a textbook example of a low-level hallucination brought on by isolation. I wrote it down in my journal, classified it, and tried to dismiss it. But as I zipped up my tent that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the silence outside was no longer just empty. It was smiling. The sightings became a daily occurrence. He was always there, always at a distance. Sometimes he would be standing on a far-off ridge, sometimes partially hidden behind a tree just 100 yards from the trail. He never got closer. He never made a sound. He just watched me, his presence a constant, silent judgment. And he was always grinning that same wide, manic, terrifying grin. My rational mind fought a desperate battle against my senses. I tried to debunk every sighting. The figure on the ridge, a strangely shaped rock formation. The man behind the tree, a dead stump with peeling bark that resembled a face. I took photographs, sketching the shapes, trying to prove to myself that it was all just a misinterpretation of my environment. But the evidence of my own eyes was relentless. The horror of the grinning man wasn't in what he did, but in what he didn't do. He didn't threaten me, he didn't chase me, he didn't brandish a weapon. His violence was purely psychological. It was the violence of being constantly observed, constantly judged by a silent, smiling entity whose motives were unknowable. Why was he smiling? Was it amusement? Malice? Was he enjoying my slow descent into fear? The not knowing was a form of torture. I started to unravel. My journal entries became less academic, more frantic. The neat clinical observations were replaced by shaky, paranoid scrawls. He was closer today. I'm sure of it. Why is he smiling? What does he know? The silence of the forest was no longer a subject of study. It was an accomplice to my tormentor. I felt like a specimen in a cruel experiment, and the grinning man was the researcher, taking notes on my psychological decay. The nights were the worst. I'd lie in my tent, my ears straining, listening for a footstep, a snapped twig, any sign that he was finally approaching. But there was never anything. Just the oppressive, smiling silence. I started having nightmares, vivid and terrifying, where I would be running through an endless forest and every tree would have his grinning face carved into its bark. I would wake up screaming, my tent a claustrophobic coffin of nylon and fear. I was a psychologist and I could recognize the symptoms of my own breakdown. The paranoia, the hallucinations, the anxiety. It was all classic. I was a textbook case. But that knowledge was no comfort. Because a part of me, a deep, primal part, knew that this was not a hallucination. The grinning man was real, and the experiment was not mine. It was his. The breaking point came during a storm. A cold, relentless Appalachian rain had been falling for 2 days, turning the trail into a river of mud. I was hypothermic, exhausted, and my morale was at an all-time low. I took shelter in one of the trail's 3-sided lean-tos, a damp, moss-covered structure that offered little protection from the driving wind and rain. I was trying to light my stove with numb, clumsy fingers when I saw him. He was standing just outside the shelter, not 20 feet away, partially obscured by the thick, swirling mist. It was the closest he had ever been. I could see him more clearly now. He was wearing the simple, homespun clothes of an old-time mountaineer. His face was weathered and deeply lined, but it was the grin that dominated everything. It was a physical impossibility, a gash of white teeth that stretched from ear to ear, splitting his face in two. It was a smile that was not made for a human skull. We stared at each other for a long, silent moment. The world seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the drumming of the rain on the shelter's tin roof. I could see his eyes now. They were not malicious or angry, they were empty. Utterly, terrifyingly empty. They were the eyes of a thing that was not a man but was merely wearing the shape of one. Then slowly he raised a hand and beckoned to me. A single silent gesture. Come. That simple invitation shattered the last of my rational mind. This was not a hallucination. This was a predator, and it was done watching. It was inviting me to become a part of its silent, smiling world. I screamed, a raw, guttural sound of pure animal terror. I didn't grab my pack. I didn't grab my gear. I just ran. I scrambled out the back of the shelter and plunged into the cold, wet, darkening woods, running blindly, away from that impossible grin. I ran for my life. I crashed through the dense, thorny undergrowth, the branches tearing at my skin, the cold rain plastering my hair to my face. I could hear nothing behind me, no footsteps, no pursuit. But I could feel him. I could feel his grin, a palpable presence in the forest, a silent, joyous laughter that echoed in the chambers of my own skull. I don't know how long I ran. I lost all track of time, all sense of direction. I was just a terrified animal, fleeing from a predator it could not comprehend. I eventually collapsed at the edge of a road, a shivering, mud-caked wreck. A passing car found me, and the driver, seeing the state I was in, called the police. I told them everything. The park rangers, the police, the doctors. I told them about the man, the grin, the constant, silent observation. They listened with patient, professional sympathy. They gave me warm blankets and hot coffee. And they wrote their report. A lone hiker, inexperienced and unprepared, suffering from exposure and severe psychological distress. All my sightings, all my terror were dismissed as the vivid hallucinations of a mind pushed to its breaking point by isolation. They found my abandoned campsite. They found my journal with its frantic, paranoid entries. It was all the proof they needed. I was just another crazy person who had gotten lost in the woods. I live in the city now. I am surrounded by noise, by people, by the constant chaotic stimulus of urban life. I have not been back to the mountains. I have not been back to the silence. But the grinning man is still with me. I see him in crowds, a smiling face that is just a little too wide. I see him in my dreams, standing at the edge of the woods, beckoning. He is no longer in the forest. He is inside me. He is the new silent observer in the landscape of my own mind. I am a cognitive psychologist. I know that what I experienced was a textbook psychotic episode. I know that the grinning man was a projection of my own fears, a phantom created by a lonely brain. I know this with academic certainty. But I am also a man who stood 20 feet from a creature with an impossible smile and empty eyes, a creature that beckoned to me from the rain. And that is a truth that no amount of logic or reason can ever explain away. So if you ever find yourself alone in the deep, quiet places of the world, and you feel the weight of a gaze on the back of your neck, don't be so quick to dismiss it as paranoia. Don't be so sure that the face you see in the shadows is just a trick of the light. The human mind is a fragile thing, and the wilderness has a way of finding the cracks. Sometimes the monsters are real, And the most terrifying ones are the ones that don't need to hunt you. They just need to watch you. They just need to smile and wait for you to hunt yourself. My name is Thomas Weaver. I'm a folklorist, a collector of stories. I've spent my life in the forgotten corners of Appalachia, recording the tales of the old-timers, the whispers of haints and plat-eyes and things that walk in the deep woods. I've always been a skeptic, an academic. I saw the stories as cultural artifacts, as metaphors for the hardships of mountain life. I believed the monsters were in the mind, not in the woods. Then, on a solo research trip into the deepest parts of the Monongahela National Forest, I learned that some stories are not stories at all. They are warnings. And I had not been listening closely enough. My goal was to document the oral histories of families who had once lived in the remote hollers before the logging companies bought them out. I was looking for a specific set of legends about a creature the old folks called the Whisperer, a thing that was said to mimic the voices of loved ones to lure people off the path. I set up a base camp deep in the forest, miles from any road, and spent my days hiking to the ruins of old homesteads. The crumbling stone chimneys and foundations like tombstones in the deep green shade. The loneliness was profound. It was a physical weight. The silence of the forest was not empty, it was full of the ghosts of the people who had lived and died there. To keep my sanity, I started talking to myself. I'd narrate my actions, debate my research theories aloud, tell myself jokes. It was a common trick among solo adventurers, a way to populate the silence with a familiar voice. On the 5th day, as I was filtering water from a creek, I was muttering to myself about the trail ahead. "Should probably take the high ridge," I said to the empty woods. "The valley looks like a swamp." A voice clear as day answered from right beside my ear. "The valley is quicker." I dropped my water bottle, spinning around, my heart leaping into my throat. There was no one there, just the dense, indifferent forest. The voice had been a whisper, a dry, rustling sound, like dead leaves skittering across stone. It was so close I had felt the breath of it on my neck. I told myself it was a hallucination, an auditory illusion. The sound of the creek, the wind in the trees, my own tired mind playing tricks on me. I was a folklorist. I knew how the mind could create monsters out of shadows. I packed my gear, my hands shaking slightly, and took the high ridge. As I walked, I could have sworn I heard a soft, dry chuckle from the valley below. The voice became my companion. It never spoke unless I spoke first, always answering my muttered thoughts, my spoken questions. It was a constant whispering presence, always just over my shoulder, always just out of sight. I never saw who it was, but I knew it was there. I started calling it the companion. At first, I tried to rationalize it. I was under stress. I was isolated. I was creating a tulpa, a thought form, a psychological projection to cope with the loneliness. I was a living case study for my own research. I tried to treat it with academic detachment, making notes in my journal about the pitch and timbre of the voice, the content of its whispers. But the companion's advice was always subtly, terribly wrong. If I was debating which path to take, it would suggest the one that led to a dead end, a treacherous rock slide, a thicket of thorns. If I was worried about my water supply, it would whisper that the stagnant, algae-choked pool ahead was perfectly safe to drink from. It wasn't trying to help me, it was trying to hurt me, but in a slow, methodical, almost scientific way. It was testing my judgment, my instincts, my will to survive. And it was always amused. When I would ignore its advice and choose the safer path, I would hear that soft, dry chuckle from the woods behind me. It was the sound of a researcher whose experiment was yielding interesting, if frustrating, results. The horror wasn't just that I was being haunted. It was that I was being studied. The roles had been reversed. I was no longer the folklorist. I was the folklore. The psychological toll was immense. I stopped talking, hoping that my silence would starve it, that it would go away if I gave it nothing to respond to. But the silence was worse. The absence of its voice was more terrifying than its presence. I would walk for hours in a state of tense, paranoid quiet, my ears straining for that dry, rustling whisper. The silence became a form of torture, a waiting game. Who would break first? I broke. After 2 days of silence, I couldn't take it anymore. "Are you still there?" I whispered into the empty forest. The answer came immediately, a soft, satisfied hiss right beside my ear. "Of course. I was just waiting for you to ask." That night, the game changed. I was huddled by my fire, trying to find some comfort in its warmth, when the companion started telling me stories. They were my stories, my memories, but twisted, made ugly. It whispered about my failed marriage, my estranged daughter, my professional disappointments. It knew my deepest regrets, my most secret shames, and it recited them back to me in that dry, rustling voice, its tone one of clinical, detached interest. It was mining my thoughts, my memories, my very identity, and using them as a weapon against me. It wasn't just a mimic, it was a parasite, and it was feeding on my psyche. I screamed at it to stop, to leave me alone, and for the first time, it laughed. Not the soft, dry chuckle from before, but a loud, rattling, triumphant laugh. It was the sound of a predator that had finally broken its prey's spirit. It was the sound of victory. I ran. I left my camp, my research, my gear, and I ran blindly through the dark Appalachian night. The companion's laughter followed me, echoing through the trees, a sound that was both inside and outside my head. It wasn't chasing me. It didn't need to. It was already with me. It was a part of me now. I stumbled upon a logging road and followed it for miles until I saw the lights of a truck. The logger who found me said I was in a state of shock, suffering from hypothermia and severe dehydration. He said I was rambling about whispers and a man who wasn't there. I was taken to a hospital, then a psychiatric facility. The diagnosis was the same one I had predicted for myself, a severe psychotic episode brought on by extreme isolation. The companion was a hallucination, a manifestation of my own internal anxieties and fears. I was given medication. I went through therapy. I was eventually released, pronounced stable. I live in the city now. I am surrounded by noise, the constant, chaotic, beautiful noise of humanity. I never go into the woods. I can't stand the quiet, because in the quiet I can still hear it. The companion never left. It's just quieter now, a faint, dry whisper at the edge of my hearing, a constant reminder of my time in the forest. Sometimes it offers advice. "That car is going too fast. You should step off the curb. Your new girlfriend seems nice. I wonder what her deepest fears are." And sometimes, when I'm at my lowest, when the memory of the forest is too much to bear, I hear it. That soft, dry, triumphant chuckle. I am a folklorist. I know the stories. I know that the whisperer of the Appalachian Mountains is not a monster that kills you. It's a monster that hollows you out and wears your life like a skin. It doesn't want your body. It wants your story. And once it has it, it will follow you forever, a silent, unseen companion whispering your own personal horror story back to you until the day you die. So if you ever find yourself alone in the deep, quiet woods and you start talking to yourself to break the silence, be very, very careful. You never know who or what might answer. And once that conversation starts, it will never, ever end. My name is Samuel. I'm a botanist specializing in the strange and resilient flora of the Appalachian Mountains. I've spent my life documenting the ghost pipes that feed on decay and the bloodroot that bleeds red when its stem is broken. I thought I understood the secrets of the forest, the silent, brutal language of growth and rot. I went on a solo hike through the most remote parts of the Great Smoky Mountains to find a rare, uncatalogued species of orchid. I found something else instead. I found a scent, and it has been hunting me ever since. I started my journey in early summer when the mountains are a riot of life. The air is thick and heavy with humidity, and the nights are a deafening chorus of cicadas and tree frogs. The forest is a claustrophobic, green-walled prison. Kudzu vines choke the trees, and rhododendron thickets, or hells as the locals call them, create impenetrable mazes. It's a place that feels ancient, alive, and utterly indifferent to human presence. The scent began on the third day. It was faint at first, a strange note in the symphony of damp earth and green leaves. It was a sweet smell, cloyingly sweet like jasmine or honeysuckle, but with an underlying current of decay. Like a bouquet of flowers left to rot in a stagnant vase. I dismissed it as a patch of carrion flowers, or perhaps a dead animal hidden somewhere in the dense undergrowth. The forest is a place of constant death and rebirth. Strange smells are part of its vocabulary. But the scent didn't fade. It grew stronger. It seemed to follow me, clinging to the humid air, a constant, sickly sweet companion. By the fifth day, it was so strong it was almost nauseating. It was thickest in the deep shaded hollers, the places where the sun never quite reached the forest floor. It felt like I was walking through the perfume of a funeral home. The normal sounds of the forest seemed to die away whenever the scent was at its strongest. The birds would go silent. The insects would stop their chirping. There was only the smell and a heavy, watchful quiet. The dreams started on the sixth night. They were not normal dreams. They were vivid, violent, and drenched in the same sickly sweet scent that haunted my waking hours. I dreamt of running through an endless forest, the trees made of pale, fleshy material, their branches like grasping, bone-white fingers. I dreamt of a woman's voice whispering my name from just behind me, her words a language I didn't understand but felt in my bones as a threat. I would wake up in my tent, my heart pounding, my sleeping bag soaked in a cold sweat, the smell of the rotting flowers thick in the air, as if it had followed me out of the dream. I am a scientist. I tried to find a logical explanation. The scent was a pollen, perhaps from an unknown plant with psychoactive properties. It was triggering my olfactory system and inducing vivid stress-related nightmares. The theory was sound. It was rational. It was also a complete and utter lie. A desperate attempt to build a wall of logic against a tide of primal, encroaching horror. The scent wasn't just a smell. It was a presence. It was the breath of something that was watching me. And it was beginning to enjoy the taste of my fear. The dreams grew worse. They were no longer just about running. They were about being caught. I dreamt of being held down by roots that grew from the forest floor while a shadowy figure leaned over me, its face a blur of motion. I would feel a sharp, cold pressure on my chest, a feeling of something being drawn out of me, a slow, agonizing siphoning of my energy, my vitality. I would wake up gasping, my body aching and profoundly, unnaturally tired, as if I had run a marathon in my sleep. The scent was a constant presence now, so thick I could almost taste it. It was in my clothes, in my hair, in my food. It was the first thing I smelled when I woke up, and the last thing I smelled before I fell into the waiting arms of my nightly terrors. My scientific detachment was gone, replaced by a raw animal fear. I was no longer a botanist studying the forest. I was prey, being slowly, methodically broken down by a predator I could not see. One night, the dream was different. I was in my tent and the scent was overwhelming, a physical weight pressing down on me. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. The flap of my tent unzipped slowly, silently. A figure stooped to enter. It was a woman, her form a silhouette against the pale moonlight. She was tall and slender, and she moved with a silent, liquid grace. She crawled towards me, her face hidden in shadow. She leaned over me, her long, dark hair falling around my face, and I could smell the scent on her. A concentrated, overpowering perfume of sweet, beautiful rot. She leaned down, her lips close to my ear, and whispered a single word in that strange, ancient language. Then I woke up. Or I thought I woke up. I sat bolt upright in my sleeping bag, my heart hammering. The tent was empty, the flap was zipped shut. But the scent was still there, stronger than ever. And on the pillow next to my head was a single perfect night black orchid, a flower I had never seen before, its petals as dark as a moonless sky. It hadn't been a dream. She had been in my tent. I abandoned my research. I abandoned my quest for the rare orchid. My only goal now was to get out of the forest. I packed my gear with shaking hands, the black orchid a malevolent presence in my pocket, and I started hiking, pushing myself harder than I ever had before. I didn't care about the trail. I just followed my compass, heading east, towards the distant promise of a road, of civilization. The forest seemed to fight me. The terrain grew more difficult, the undergrowth thicker. The scent was a constant companion, a mocking reminder that I could not escape. The whispers started during the day now, faint and teasing at the edge of my hearing. I was unraveling, my mind fraying under the constant multi-sensory assault. On the second day of my desperate flight, I stumbled into a clearing I had never seen on any map. It was a small, hidden place, a natural bowl in the mountainside, and it was filled with graves. Not the neat, orderly graves of a church cemetery, but dozens of old, unmarked fieldstone cairns arranged in a spiral pattern. The air in the clearing was cold and still, and the scent of the rotting flowers was so overpowering it made my eyes water. In the center of the spiral of graves, a woman was kneeling. She was dressed in a simple, old-fashioned black dress, her long dark hair covering her face. She was humming a low, mournful tune and tending to the graves, placing a single black orchid on each one. I hid behind a tree, my breath catching in my throat. It was the woman from my dream. As I watched, she finished her work and stood up. She turned, and for a moment her face was visible. It was a young, beautiful face, but her eyes were ancient and filled with a profound, bottomless sorrow. She looked directly at the spot where I was hiding, and she smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was a smile of ownership. A smile that said, "You are mine. You have always been mine." That smile broke me. I ran. I crashed through the forest, a raw, continuous scream tearing from my throat. I ran from the graves, from the woman in black, from the scent that was now a part of me. I ran until I collapsed on a dirt road where a park ranger found me, delirious and babbling about a woman and flowers and a scent that was eating me alive. The official report says I suffered a psychotic break due to dehydration and exhaustion. They found no clearing, no graves, no woman in black. They found no trace of the black orchid I had sworn was in my pocket. It was all a hallucination, a story my broken mind had created. I live in a city now, a place of concrete and steel and noise. I have surrounded myself with the artificial, the man-made, to try and keep the wild, natural world at bay. But I can't escape the scent. It comes to me at night, a faint, sweet, rotten perfume that drifts in through my closed windows. It fills my dreams. I am a botanist. I know that some plants are parasitic. They feed on a host, drawing out its life force until it withers and dies. I now believe that some places, some entities are the same. The thing in the Great Smoky Mountains, the woman in black. She is a parasite. She feeds on the life, the vitality, the sanity of those who wander into her garden. The scent is her pollen, the way she marks her prey. The dreams are the way she feeds, So if you ever find yourself hiking in the deep, ancient mountains of Appalachia, and you smell something sweet on the air, something like flowers on the verge of rot, I want you to remember my story. It's not a flower. It's not a dead animal. It's a warning. It's a claim. It means you have been chosen. Turn around, run, and pray you can outrun the bloom, because once that scent gets inside you, it will never, ever let you go. My name is Daniel. I'm a descendant of coal miners, but I traded the dust and the darkness of my family's past for a degree in agricultural science. I study soil, the lifeblood of a region that has had so much of its own blood spilled. I went hiking on the Appalachian Trail through the mountains of West Virginia to collect soil samples, to read the chemical stories left behind by a century of industry and neglect. I was looking for scientific truth. I found a truth that was far older and far more terrifying. The trail in this part of the state is a lonely, haunted place. It winds through forests that have reclaimed the skeletons of old coal towns, past slag heaps that bleed orange poison into the creeks. The air is thick with the ghosts of a dead industry. On my third day, a sudden violent thunderstorm rolled in, the kind that turns the sky black and the trail into a river of mud. Disoriented and seeking shelter, I took what I thought was a game trail, a path of least resistance leading down into a deep, narrow valley. A holler, as the locals call it. The moment I descended below the ridgeline, the storm seemed to quiet. The air grew still and heavy, thick with the smell of wood smoke, damp earth, and something else. Something sweet and vaguely metallic, like fresh-cut apples and old blood. The holler was a world unto itself, a pocket of unnatural calm. The trees, ancient towering oaks and maples, formed a dense canopy that the rain could barely penetrate. After walking for another hour, I stumbled into a clearing. And a village. It wasn't on any map. A small cluster of hand-hewn log cabins arranged in a circle around a massive blackened fire pit. Smoke curled from stone chimneys. A few people moved between the cabins, their movements slow and deliberate. They were dressed in simple, homespun clothes that looked like they belonged to another century. They stopped what they were doing and turned to look at me, their faces unreadable. There was no surprise, no alarm. Just a quiet, patient watchfulness. It felt less like I had stumbled upon them by accident, and more like I had finally arrived at a long-scheduled appointment. An old man with a long white beard and eyes the color of faded denim stepped forward. "You're lost, son," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. It wasn't a question. "I am," I admitted, my own voice sounding thin and out of place. The storm brings what it will," he said, a faint, fixed smile on his lips. "And the holler accepts what is given. You've come at a good time. We're preparing for the harvest festival. You'll stay. You'll be our guest of honor." His hospitality was absolute, his tone leaving no room for refusal. The other villagers smiled the same fixed, placid smile. I was soaked, lost and exhausted. I had no choice but to accept. As he led me toward one of the cabins, I noticed strange, intricate symbols carved into the door frames, spirals and lattices that seemed to pulse and shift in my peripheral vision. The sweet metallic smell was stronger here. It was the smell of the soil itself. It was the smell of the harvest. The hospitality of the holler was overwhelming and deeply unsettling. They gave me a dry set of clothes, simple linen trousers, and a shirt that felt impossibly soft. They fed me a thick, rich stew full of root vegetables and a dark, savory meat I couldn't identify. It was delicious, but it had that same underlying sweet, metallic taste as the air, the soil. The people were kind. Their voices soft, their smiles constant. But their eyes were empty. They looked at me with a sort of placid bovine contentment, the way a farmer might look at a prize-winning hog. They called themselves the children of the loam. The old man, Their elder was named Silas. He told me their story. He said their ancestors had settled this holler 200 years ago, fleeing the corrupt, sinful world outside. They lived in harmony with the land, he explained. The land provided for them, and they in turn provided for the land. The soil here is special, Silas said, his pale eyes gleaming in the firelight. It's rich. It gives us everything we need. But it's a hungry soil. It requires a settlement, a tithe. Once a year at the harvest, we give back to the land what it has given to us. The children were the strangest part. They didn't run or play or shout. They moved with the same slow, deliberate grace as the adults. They would sit in a circle playing a silent game with small, polished stones. Sometimes they would stop and stare at me, their heads tilted, their fixed smiles unwavering. One little girl walked up to me and handed me a doll she had made from a corn husk. It was dressed in a tiny replica of my own hiking clothes. I thanked her, my throat tight. She just smiled and walked away. That night, I was given a bed in one of the cabins. I lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the holler. There were no crickets, no owls. Just the whisper of the wind, and faintly from the center of the village, a low, rhythmic chanting. It was a song in a language I didn't recognize, ancient and guttural. It was the sound of the earth itself, humming in its sleep. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. This was just an isolated, deeply religious community. An Amish or Mennonite offshoot, perhaps. Their strangeness was just a product of their isolation. The fixed smiles, the empty eyes. It was just the result of generations of inbreeding. The stew was probably just venison. My scientific mind desperately searched for logical explanations. But the feeling of wrongness was a physical weight, a pressure in my chest. I was not a guest here. I was an ingredient. The next day, the preparations for the harvest festival began. The men sharpened long, curved knives that looked like antique scythes. The women wove intricate garlands from corn husks and strange, dark red flowers that grew only in the holler. The children painted the spiral symbols I had seen on the door frames onto large, flat stones. The whole village moved with a quiet, joyful purpose. The air was thick with anticipation. I tried to ask Silas when I would be able to leave. "The festival is tomorrow night," he said, his smile never wavering. "You wouldn't want to miss the harvest. It's the most important day of the year. It's the day we feed the soil. It's the day you fulfill your purpose." His words sent a jolt of pure, cold terror through me. My purpose. Guest of honor. The harvest. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The rich soil, the bountiful crops, the community's health and prosperity. It was all paid for. The tithe the land required wasn't animal or crop. It was human. I was the harvest. That afternoon, I saw them bring another one in. A young woman, a backpacker, her face a mask of confusion and fear. Two of the village men were leading her into the clearing. They were smiling their placid smiles. "Don't be afraid," they told her. "You're just in time for the festival. You're a guest of honor." They had 2 sacrifices this year. The land would be doubly pleased. Panic gave way to a cold, analytical calm. I was a scientist. I had to observe, to document, to understand. I began to study the soil in earnest, surreptitiously taking samples, examining its composition. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was black and impossibly rich with a strange, fibrous texture. And it was full of human bone fragments. Not ancient bones, but recent ones, still holding the faint metallic tang of blood. The entire holler was a graveyard. The crops were growing from human remains. The children of the loam were not just sacrificing people. They were consuming them indirectly through the food they grew. The stew, the dark, savory meat. My stomach churned. That night I didn't sleep. I watched from the window of my cabin as the villagers gathered around the great fire pit. They were chanting, their voices rising and falling in that ancient, terrifying rhythm. Silas stood before them holding one of the curved scythes. "The soil is hungry," he cried, his voice booming through the holler. "The land provides and we must provide in return. Bring forth the harvest." 2 men dragged me from my cabin. Another 2 dragged the terrified young woman. They led us to the center of the circle, to 2 large, upright wooden posts carved with the spiral symbols. The villagers watched us, their faces ecstatic, their smiles wider than ever. They were not monsters. They were farmers preparing to feed their field. They tied us to the posts. The young woman was sobbing, begging for her life. I was strangely calm. My mind was racing, analyzing, trying to find a variable, a flaw in the system. Silas approached me, the scythe gleaming in the firelight. "Do not be afraid, son," he said, his voice gentle. "Your ending is a new beginning. Your blood will feed the soil. Your flesh will become the corn. Your bones will become the earth. You will become one with the holler. It is a great honor." He raised the scythe. The chanting grew louder. The fire roared. And in that moment I saw my chance. The ropes they had used were old, made of natural fiber. And I had a small, sharp soil knife hidden in my boot. As Silas brought the scythe down, I twisted, slicing at the ropes that bound my wrists. The blade cut deep into my own flesh, but the ropes gave way. I lunged forward, tackling Silas, sending the scythe flying into the darkness. I grabbed the sobbing, terrified woman by the hand. "Run!" I screamed. We ran. We plunged into the dark, trackless woods, the enraged screams of the children of the loam behind us. They were not fast, but they were relentless. We could hear them moving through the trees, their calm, placid demeanor gone, replaced by the fury of a farmer whose prize crop has been stolen. We ran for our lives, scrambling up the steep, muddy walls of the holler. The forest that had seemed like a cage was now our only hope of escape. We could hear them behind us, their voices calling out, not with threats, but with promises. "Come back. The soil needs you. It is your purpose." We didn't stop until we reached the ridgeline, until the sweet, rotten smell of the holler was replaced by the clean, cold scent of rain. We stumbled onto a road and flagged down a passing truck. The driver, a grizzled logger, took one look at our torn clothes, our bleeding hands, our terrified faces, and didn't ask any questions. He just drove. We told our story to the state police. They launched an investigation. They sent a helicopter to search the area I described. They found nothing. No village, no cabins, no people. The holler was empty, as if it had never existed. The soil samples I had managed to grab, they were just normal, unremarkable Appalachian dirt. My story was dismissed as a shared hallucination, a folie à deux brought on by stress and exposure. But I know what I saw. I know what I smelled. The horror of that place wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was a system, a perfect, self-sustaining ecosystem of life and death, where humans were just another crop to be planted, tended, and harvested. So if you ever find yourself lost in the deep, ancient mountains of Appalachia, and you stumble upon a place that feels too peaceful, too perfect, and you smell something sweet on the air like apples and old blood, don't accept their hospitality, don't eat their food, don't become their guest of honor. Because the soil in those hollers is very, very hungry, and the harvest is always coming. My name is Ethan. I'm a park ranger, or at least I used to be. For a decade, the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina were my office and my church. I knew the trails like the lines on my hand, understood the language of the forest, the rustle of a black bear in the undergrowth, the cry of a hawk on the thermals, the heavy, watchful silence of the deep woods. I respected the mountains, but I never feared them. I believed the only real monsters out here were human. I was wrong. The oldest monsters wear human skin, but only as a suggestion. I was on a 3-day solo patrol checking on trail conditions in a remote section of the Pisgah National Forest. It was late autumn, the bone season, when the trees are bare and the forest feels stark and exposed. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves. On my second day, I took a less-traveled spur trail down into a deep, narrow valley. A holler so isolated it felt like a place that time had forgotten. The air grew still and cold, the usual chorus of birds and insects falling away into an oppressive silence. I was rounding a bend in the trail when I saw him. He was standing by a creek, skipping stones across the water. He was an old man, rail-thin, dressed in worn-out overalls and a flannel shirt. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, and he had a gentle, almost vacant smile. He looked like 1,000 other mountain hermits I'd encountered over the years. Reclusive, harmless. A man who had simply decided to unplug from the world. "Afternoon, Ranger," he said, his voice a soft, whispery drawl. He didn't seem surprised to see me. "Afternoon," I replied, keeping a professional distance. "Everything all right out here?" "Just enjoying the quiet," he said, his smile widening slightly. "Don't get many visitors down in this holler. People tend to stick to the high ground." He tossed another stone, and it skipped 7 times before sinking into the dark water. "But I knew you were coming. I could feel you on the ridge." A small prickle of unease went down my spine. It was a strange thing to say, but I dismissed it as the rambling of an old man used to his own company. I made a note of his location, reminded him of the park's camping regulations, and continued on my way. As I walked away, I had the distinct feeling of his eyes on my back, and that gentle smile felt less like friendliness and more like a silent, patient assessment. I made camp that night about 2 miles further down the holler near a small waterfall. The silence was absolute, a physical weight. As I sat by my fire, the old man's words echoed in my head. "I knew you were coming." It was probably nothing, just a lucky guess, but the woods felt different now. The silence felt attentive. I was drifting off to sleep in my tent when I heard a sound, the soft rhythmic splash of a stone skipping across water. It was coming from the creek near my camp. I sat bolt upright, my heart hammering. It was the middle of the night. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and unzipped my tent. He was there, the old man, standing by the creek just as before, skipping stones in the pale moonlight. But something was wrong. He seemed taller. When I had seen him earlier, he was a small, wiry man, maybe 5.5 feet tall. Now he looked closer to 6 feet. His limbs seemed longer, his frame less frail. "Couldn't sleep either, Ranger?" he asked, his voice still a soft drawl, but with a new, deeper resonance. He turned to face me, and his smile was wider now, stretching his wrinkled face into an unnatural shape. "It's a good night for it. The water's hungry." I stood frozen, my flashlight beam fixed on him. My rational mind was screaming at me. "It's a trick of the light. The shadows are playing with your perception." But my gut, the primal animal part of my brain, knew that what I was seeing was real. He had grown. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice tight. His smile widened even more, a terrifying crescent moon gash in his face. "Why, I came to see you, of course. It's been so long since one of our family came home." "I'm not your family," I said, backing away slowly. "Oh, but you are," he said, and he took a step towards me. And as he moved, I heard it. A faint, wet, cracking sound. The sound of bones stretching, of cartilage popping. He was getting taller, right before my eyes. He was 6'3" now, his overalls straining at the seams, his long, thin arms dangling at his sides. "You have the old blood in you. I can smell it. The blood of the ones who first settled this holler. The ones who made the pact. You belong here. With us." The pact. The old stories. The ones the locals whispered about but never spoke of aloud. Stories of the first settlers, starving and desperate, who made a deal with something ancient in the mountains. Something that gave them prosperity in exchange for something else. He took another step, and another. With each step came that sickening, wet, cracking sound. 6'5", 6'7". His head was now brushing the low-hanging branches of the trees. His smile was a monstrous, impossible thing, his eyes two black pits of ancient hunger. "It's time to come home," he rasped, his voice now a deep, guttural growl. He reached for me with a hand that was no longer human, his fingers elongated into pale, spider-like talons. I didn't scream. I didn't think. I just ran. I turned and plunged into the dark woods, the sound of his low, rumbling laughter and the wet, cracking sound of his continued growth chasing me through the night. I ran blindly, crashing through the undergrowth, my only thought to get out of the holler. The forest, a place I had always considered my home, was now a terrifying alien landscape. Every tree was a hiding place for him, every shadow was his. I could hear him behind, me, moving with an unnatural speed, his long limbs carrying him through the dense forest as if it were an open field. He wasn't just chasing me. He was herding me, cutting off my escape routes, driving me deeper into the woods. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a light ahead, a campfire. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through me. Other people, safety. I burst into a small clearing and collapsed, gasping for breath. 3 young campers were sitting around a fire, their faces a mixture of shock and alarm at my sudden appearance. "Help me," I gasped, pointing back into the darkness. There's a man. I couldn't finish. The words wouldn't come. I could only point at the woods and whisper, "He won't leave me alone." And then the world went black. I woke up to the smell of coffee and the concerned face of one of the campers, a young woman named Sarah, leaning over me. I was wrapped in a sleeping bag by their fire. "Hey, take it easy," she said softly. "You passed out. You were rambling about a tall man." I sat up, my body aching, my mind a fog of terror. "Where is he?" I asked, my eyes scanning the dark tree line. "Did you see him?" The campers exchanged nervous glances. "We didn't see anyone," one of the young men said. "We heard you crashing through the woods, and then you just appeared. We looked, but there was nothing out there, no tracks but yours." They didn't believe me. I could see it in their eyes. They saw a park ranger who had lost his nerve, a man who had been spooked by a shadow and had a panic attack. But they were scared. My terror was real and it was contagious. They packed up their camp, their movements hurried and anxious, and decided to hike out with me at first light. They didn't want to stay in the woods another night. Not after seeing the look in my eyes. We hiked out in a tense, exhausted silence. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see a tall figure with an impossible smile watching us from the ridges. But there was nothing. Just the silent, ancient mountains. When we reached the ranger station, I told my story to my superior officer. I told him about the old man, the growth, the chase. He listened patiently, then ordered me to take a mandatory leave of absence for psychological evaluation. The official report cited extreme stress and isolation-induced hallucinations. They sent a team of rangers to the holler to investigate. They found my abandoned campsite. They found the old man's fire pit by the creek. But they found no evidence of the man himself, no cabin, no tracks, nothing. He was a ghost, a figment of my fractured mind. But one of the rangers who went on that search, a friend of mine, told me something later in confidence. He said that while they were in the holler, the silence was so deep, so absolute that it made their skin crawl. And he said that the whole time he had the unshakable feeling that they were being watched by something very old and very, very tall. I never went back to the field. I couldn't. The mountains, my sanctuary, were now a place of profound horror. I live in a small town now, far from the deep woods, but I'm not free. The tall man of the holler is still with me. I see him in my dreams, his smile stretching, his limbs elongating, his voice whispering that I have the old blood, that it's time to come home. The horror isn't that I was hunted, it's that I was recognized. I was part of a story I didn't know existed, a pact made by my ancestors that is still being paid for in blood and bone. So if you ever find yourself hiking in the deep, quiet hollers of Appalachia, and you meet a friendly old man who seems to know who you are, don't be charmed by his mountain wisdom. Don't be comforted by his gentle smile. Look at his height, and if he seems just a little bit taller than you remember, run. Run and don't ever look back. Because some families have very deep roots, and some debts are never fully paid. My name is Caleb. I'm a professional hiker and guide. My friends and I, Liam, a pragmatic ex-military climber, Owen, our meticulous navigator, and Finn, the group's resident adrenaline junkie. We make our living in the wild places. We seek out the challenges, the remote peaks, the trails that haven't seen a human foot in years. That's what brought us to a remote stretch of the New River Gorge in West Virginia. It was supposed to be a routine, if challenging, expedition. We had no idea we were about to become part of a story that has been playing out on that riverbank for centuries. We set up our camp on a secluded gravel bar, the river a dark, churning presence beside us. The gorge was a place of oppressive beauty. The cliffs rose on either side like ancient silent giants, and the dense forest of hemlock and rhododendron felt like a cage. As dusk settled, a thick, clammy fog rolled in from the water, swallowing the world in a blanket of gray. The air grew heavy, smelling of wet stone, decaying leaves, and the river itself a cold, metallic scent. The usual chorus of cicadas and crickets fell silent. The only sound was the deep, hungry roar of the water. We built a fire, its light a small, defiant island in the encroaching darkness. We stayed up late, drinking whiskey and telling stories of past expeditions, our laughter sounding small and hollow against the roar of the river. As the night wore on, a deep, unshakable sense of dread began to settle over me. The fog seemed to be getting thicker, the roar of the water louder. I suggested we turn in, but the others, buoyed by whiskey and bravado, laughed it off. I retreated to my tent, my heart pounding with a nameless anxiety. Leaving them by the dying fire, I was woken sometime after midnight by a sound that didn't belong. It was a soft, rhythmic creaking, like old wood straining against a current. I lay in my tent listening, my blood running cold. It was the sound of a boat. I unzipped my tent flap just an inch and peered out. The fog was so thick I could barely see the river, but I could make out a shape on the water. A small, flat-bottomed ferry boat emerging from the mist, a single lantern hanging from its bow. It was moving slowly, unnaturally against the powerful current. And standing at the stern, holding a long pole, was a tall, gaunt figure, his face hidden in the shadows of a wide-brimmed hat. My rational mind screamed that it was impossible. A trick of the fog and the moonlight. But my gut, honed by years in the wild, knew what I was seeing was real. Then I saw her. On the riverbank, not 50 feet from our camp, a woman was standing. She was dressed in a simple, old-fashioned white dress, her long, dark hair plastered to her skin as if she had just emerged from the water. She was perfectly still, her face turned towards the ferryman, her form a pale, ghostly silhouette in the mist. I wanted to scream, to wake my friends, but I was paralyzed by a terror, so profound it felt like a physical weight. The ferryman pulled the boat towards the bank where the woman stood. He didn't speak. She didn't move. They were two figures in a silent, ghostly tableau, reenacting a tragedy from a century ago. Then the woman turned her head, and she looked directly at me, at my tent. Her face was a pale, featureless oval in the fog, but I could feel her gaze, a cold, dead weight that seemed to suck the air from my lungs. She raised a single slender arm and pointed not at the boat but at me. She wasn't waiting for the ferryman. She was showing him his new passenger. That broke the spell. I scrambled back into my tent, my heart hammering against my ribs. I zipped the flap shut, a useless, flimsy barrier against the impossible thing I had just seen. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it was a nightmare, a whiskey-fueled hallucination. After a few minutes, I risked another look. The riverbank was empty. The boat was gone. The woman was gone. There was only the fog and the roar of the water. I told myself I had imagined it, but the terror was real, and it was just beginning. I couldn't sleep. I lay in my tent, listening to the sounds of the night, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sending a fresh jolt of fear through me. I finally decided I couldn't stay in the tent alone. I needed the safety of my friends. I needed to know I wasn't going crazy. I crept out of my tent and made my way to the one Liam and Owen shared. "Liam," I whispered, shaking the tent. "Wake up, something's wrong." He grumbled, then unzipped the flap. "Caleb, what is it?" "There was someone out here," I said, my voice trembling. "A woman and a boat." Liam sighed, the sound of a skeptic being forced to deal with a hysteric. "You were dreaming, man. Come on." But he saw the look in my eyes and his expression changed. He woke Owen and I told them what I had seen. "What could it be?" Owen said, his voice filled with a mixture of excitement and genuine fear. "No one lives out here." "We're seeing a hallucination," Liam countered, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. We decided to investigate. Armed with flashlights, we walked towards the spot on the riverbank where I had seen the woman. The fog was still thick, our flashlight beams cutting weak, hazy tunnels through the gloom. The air was cold and heavy with the smell of the river. As we approached the spot, the roar of the water seemed to quiet, the world falling into an unnatural, expectant silence. And then we saw it. In the soft, wet sand of the riverbank, there was a single set of footprints. They were the prints of bare feet, small and delicate. They led from the water's edge, stopped at the exact spot where I had seen the woman standing, and then they ended. There were no tracks leading away. It was as if she had simply materialized from the river and then vanished into thin air. That's when we heard the creaking again. The ferryboat was back. It was closer this time, just offshore, its lantern a single baleful eye in the fog. The ferryman stood at the stern, a tall, dark silhouette, and sitting on the bench in the middle of the boat was the woman in white. She was looking at us, and she was smiling. We ran. We didn't look back. We crashed through the campsite, grabbed Finn, who was still passed out in his tent, and scrambled up the steep trail out of the gorge. Behind us, we could hear a woman's voice, a beautiful, mournful song that echoed through the fog, a sound of both sorrow and seduction. It was a song that promised peace and release and an end to all worldly troubles. It was a song that promised a quiet passage on a silent river. We made it back to our truck, threw our gear and a still groggy Finn in the back, and sped away, leaving the haunted eddy and its ghostly inhabitants behind. We drove all night, the woman's song echoing in our heads. We never went back. The official explanation is that we were a group of young men who got drunk and spooked ourselves with ghost stories. A classic case of mass hysteria, but we know what we saw. I've spent the last year trying to understand it. As a guide, I've tried to find a rational explanation. The ferryman, the woman, They are archetypes, manifestations of the river's dangerous power. A story created perhaps to warn people away. But that doesn't explain the footprints. It doesn't explain the boat. It doesn't explain the song that still haunts my dreams. The horror of that place is not that it's haunted. It's that it's a trap. A place where the boundary between story and reality is thin, where the legends are not just stories but active predatory forces. The woman doesn't just haunt the river, she recruits. She calls to the lonely, the lost, the grieving, offering them a place on the ferryman's boat, a final passage away from their pain. So if you ever find yourself on the banks of an old dark river in the heart of Appalachia and you hear a beautiful sad song on the wind, don't try to find its source. Don't be drawn in by its promise of peace. It's not a song of sorrow, it's a song of hunger. It's the sound of the ferryman's toll being called due, and he will always, always find a passenger. My name is Jacob. I'm a land surveyor. My job is to walk the forgotten lines, to find the old markers and boundaries that define the hidden corners of the world. It's a quiet, solitary profession, and that's what drew me to it. I've spent most of my adult life in the deep woods of Appalachia, comfortable with the silence and the solitude. I always believed that the mountains were a neutral place, a sanctuary from the messy, violent world of men. I learned last fall in a remote holler in eastern Kentucky that the mountains are not a sanctuary. They are just a better place to hide the bodies. I was hired to survey a large, disputed tract of land deep in the mountains, an area that hadn't been officially surveyed since the 1920s. It was a place of steep ridges, dense rhododendron thickets, and a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The land was caught in a bitter, generations-old feud between two families, the Hollerans and the McCluskys. They were two of the oldest families in the region, their histories a tangled, bloody web of moonshine wars, land disputes, and bad blood that went back to the Civil War. I set up a small base camp and spent my days hiking the rugged terrain, using my GPS and old hand-drawn maps to try and make sense of the conflicting property lines. The work was slow and difficult, the forest was a labyrinth, and the air was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the weather. I felt like I was trespassing, not just on land but in a private, ongoing war. On my third day, I was working my way up a steep wooded ridge when I heard voices, angry voices coming from a small clearing just ahead. I dropped to the ground, my heart pounding, and crawled to the edge of the clearing, peering through the dense undergrowth. What I saw will be burned into my memory until the day I die. Two men whom I recognized from town as the Holleran brothers were standing over a third man who was on his knees. The man on the ground was a McClusky. They weren't arguing. They were passing a sentence. "This land is ours, McClusky," the older Holleran brother said, his voice a low, cold growl. "It's always been ours, and you've been warned." He raised a hunting rifle. The McClusky man looked up, his face a mask of defiance and terror. He opened his mouth to speak, but the rifle shot was a deafening crack that echoed through the silent woods. The McClusky man fell forward, a dark stain spreading across the back of his shirt. I had just witnessed a murder, an execution, and in the sudden ringing silence that followed, the older Holleran brother looked up, his eyes scanning the tree line, and for a single heart-stopping moment his gaze met mine. I didn't think. I just ran. I scrambled back from the edge of the clearing and plunged into the forest, the sound of my own panicked breathing a roar in my ears. I didn't know if they had seen me clearly, but I couldn't take the chance. I was a witness, and in a place like this, witnesses don't live long. I ran for miles, my surveyor's knowledge of the terrain the only thing that kept me from running in circles. I didn't go back to my camp. I knew they would look for me there. I just ran. Deeper into the wilderness, my only thought to put as much distance as possible between myself and the Halloran brothers. As night fell, I found a small rock outcropping and huddled beneath it, shivering with cold and fear. The forest, which had always been my sanctuary, was now my prison. I was trapped. I was being hunted. And I was completely, utterly alone. But I was wrong. I wasn't alone. Sometime after midnight, I heard them. Not the Hollorans, different voices, low whispers coming from the woods around me. They were circling my position, their movements silent and stealthy. "He's here," one voice whispered. "He saw it all." "He's our proof," another voice said. "He's our justice." I peered out from behind the rock and saw them. 3 men, their faces grim in the pale moonlight. They were McCluskey's. They hadn't come to save me, they had come to collect me. I was no longer just a witness, I was a weapon. And they were going to use me. I was trapped. Not between a rock and a hard place, but between 2 sides of a private, brutal war that had been raging in these mountains for 150 years. The Hollorans were hunting me to silence me. The McCluskeys were hunting me to use me. Both sides wanted me. And neither side cared if I survived the process. The next few days were a living hell. I was a fugitive in a wilderness that had become a battlefield. I moved constantly, never sleeping in the same place twice, foraging for food, my body and my mind pushed to their absolute limits. And they were always there. I would catch glimpses of them in the distance, the Hollorans moving through the woods with the grim purpose of hunters closing in on their prey, and the McCluskeys shadowing me always just out of sight, their presence a constant unnerving pressure. They weren't trying to help me, they were hurting me, trying to keep me alive and in the area until they could figure out how to use me. I was a pawn in their bloody, ancient game. My life had been reduced to a single strategic value. The horror wasn't just the fear of being caught, it was the utter dehumanization of it. I was no longer Jacob, the land surveyor. I was the witness, an object, a piece of evidence to be captured or destroyed. On the 5th day, I made a mistake. Exhausted and dehydrated, I stumbled into a clearing and right into them. The Halloran brothers, they were waiting for me. "Looks like you got yourself lost, surveyor," the older one said, his rifle leveled at my chest. His smile was a cold, dead thing. "We're here to help you find your way. A permanent way." He started to raise the rifle. I closed my eyes, a dumb, silent prayer on my lips. This was it. This was the end, but the shot never came. Instead, another shot rang out from the trees behind me. The younger Halloran brother grunted and fell, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. The McCluskeys had arrived. The clearing erupted into a chaos of gunfire and shouting. It wasn't a firefight. It was a backwoods ambush, brutal and efficient. The older Halloran brother went down, his defiant curse cut short by a shotgun blast. The McCluskeys emerged from the trees, their faces grim and determined. The patriarch of the family, a hard old man with eyes like chips of granite, walked up to me. He wasn't smiling. "You're coming with us," he said. It wasn't a request. "You're going to tell the sheriff exactly what you saw." They marched me out of the woods at gunpoint. The hunters had become my rescuers, but I felt no relief. I had just traded one cage for another. They took me to the county sheriff, a man whose last name, I noted with a sinking heart, was McCluskey. I told my story. I told them about the execution, the hunt. The sheriff listened, nodding, his expression one of solemn concern. He took my statement. He promised me protection. He promised me justice. He was lying. The next morning, the official story hit the local news. A tragic hunting accident. The Halloran brothers, known for their reckless behavior, had accidentally shot each other while illegally hunting on disputed land. The witness, a land surveyor found wandering in the woods in a state of shock, had confirmed their aggressive and unstable nature. The case was closed. The McCluskeys had gotten what they wanted. They had eliminated their rivals, and they had used me to do it. My testimony had been twisted, my role in the story rewritten to fit their narrative. I was not a witness to a murder, I was a convenient corroborator of an accident. They didn't need me to testify in court. They just needed my presence to legitimize their lie. They let me go. The sheriff drove me to the county line himself. "I'd advise you to keep driving, Mr. Jacob," he said, his voice friendly but his eyes cold as a winter river. "This is family business, and you're not family. There's nothing for you here anymore." I drove away from that town, from those mountains, and I never looked back. I had walked into a war that had been raging for a century, and I had been used as a bullet. The horror of what happened to me isn't about ghosts or monsters, it's about the terrifying, enduring power of human hatred. It's about the way violence can become a tradition, a legacy passed down from one generation to the next, until it's as much a part of the landscape as the mountains themselves. So if you ever find yourself in the deep, quiet hollers of Appalachia, and you hear angry voices on the wind, don't be a hero. Don't be a witness. Just turn around and walk away. Because there are feuds in those mountains that are older than the state itself. And if you get caught in the middle, you'll discover that the only thing more terrifying than being hunted by your enemy is being rescued by your friends, and that there is no justice. There is only the feud, and the feud is forever. My name is Dr. Julian Croft. I'm a botanist, and for 30 years the Appalachian Mountains have been my laboratory and my sanctuary. I specialize in the region's endemic flora, particularly the rare and often overlooked species that thrive in the secluded hollers and high, lonely balds. I've always found a profound sense of peace in the quiet, patient world of plants. They are honest organisms, they don't lie, they don't hide their intentions, they simply are. I went into the Great Smoky Mountains last spring on a routine expedition to document a rare species of lady slipper orchid. I went in believing in the simple, elegant logic of the natural world. I came out believing in something else entirely. The area I was exploring was a remote, trackless valley in the North Carolina section of the park, a place that required a 2-day hike just to reach. It was a world of oppressive humidity, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The chorus of cicadas was a constant high-pitched thrum that seemed to vibrate in my bones. The mountains here don't just surround you, they press in on you, their ancient green shoulders blocking out the sky, creating a profound sense of claustrophobia. I found the orchids on the 3rd day, a small, miraculous colony growing in the deep shade of a hemlock grove. They were beautiful, their delicate pouch-like flowers a vibrant splash of pink and white against the dark, loamy soil. I spent the afternoon documenting them, taking notes and, of course, taking photographs. I used a high-resolution digital camera for my scientific records, but I also carried an old 35mm film camera for my personal work. I've always loved the texture and the unpredictability of film, the way it captures a mood, not just an image. As I was photographing the orchids, I noticed a different patch of flowers nearby. They were a species I had never seen before. They resembled black-eyed Susans, but their petals were a pale, almost translucent white, and their centers were a deep, velvety, light-absorbing black. They were stunning. I spent a full roll of film on them, captivated by their strange, ethereal beauty. I felt a strange sense of unease as I photographed them, a feeling that they were aware of me. I dismissed it as romantic foolishness, the projection of a lonely man onto an indifferent landscape. I camped near the flowers that night, the silence of the holler absolute. The usual nocturnal sounds of the forest were absent. No owls, no crickets, not even the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. It was a dead, sterile quiet, as if the entire valley were holding its breath. I sat by my small fire, reviewing the digital photos I had taken on my camera's small screen. The images of the orchids were perfect, but when I got to the photos of the strange white wildflowers, a cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. On the camera's screen, they looked different. The centers of the flowers, which had appeared to be a solid velvety black to my naked eye, now showed a strange, complex pattern. It looked almost like the iris of an eye. I zoomed in. The pattern was incredibly detailed, a radial burst of dark, intricate lines. It was beautiful, but it was also deeply, fundamentally wrong. It was a pattern that did not belong in the botanical world. I told myself it was a digital artifact, a trick of the pixels and the low light. The sensor on my camera was probably picking up on some ultraviolet pattern invisible to the human eye. It was a fascinating discovery, not a terrifying one. I was a scientist. There was a logical explanation for everything. That night, I had a nightmare. I dreamt I was lying in my tent, paralyzed, while something outside scraped against the nylon fabric. I could hear a soft, wet, whispering sound like damp leaves being dragged across the ground. In the dream, I managed to look up and I saw a face peering down at me through the translucent fabric of the tent. It was a woman's face, pale and gaunt, but her eyes were the deep, velvety black centers of the flowers, and they were staring directly into me, seeing everything. I woke up with a gasp, my heart hammering. The dream so vivid it felt like a memory. The next morning, I tried to shake off the dream. It was just a nightmare, a product of an uneasy mind in an unfamiliar place. But the feeling of wrongness lingered. I decided to pack up my camp and hike to a different part of the valley to put some distance between myself and the strange, watchful flowers. As I was breaking down my tent, I noticed something on the ground near where I had been sleeping. A single, perfect white petal. It was from one of the strange wildflowers, but there were none growing this close to my campsite. Had the wind blown it here? But there had been no wind last night. I picked it up. The texture was not like a normal flower petal. It was thicker, more resilient, with a smooth, almost waxy feel, like preserved skin. I dropped it, a wave of revulsion washing over me. I hiked for the rest of the day, pushing myself hard, trying to outrun the feeling of unease. I made camp on a high ridge, hoping the open space and the wide open sky would dispel the claustrophobia of the holler. As the sun set, I sat and watched the mountains turn from green to gold to a deep, bruised purple. The world felt normal again. The fear began to recede. I decided to develop a roll of film from my 35mm camera. I had a small, portable developing kit for fieldwork. I wanted to see the images of the strange flowers on film to see if the eye pattern was there or if it had just been a digital glitch. I went through the chemical process, my hands moving with practiced precision in the changing bag. After the film was developed and fixed, I held the long strip of negatives up to the light of my headlamp. The photos of the orchids were beautiful. Then I got to the frames of the white wildflowers. My breath caught in my throat. On the film, the images were even more terrifying. The black centers were not just patterns, they were unmistakably human eyes. They were wide, staring, and filled with a silent, screaming terror. And in the reflection of each tiny, perfect photographic eye, I could see a distorted image of myself, holding my camera, taking the picture. I dropped the strip of negatives as if it had burned me. This was not a digital artifact. This was not a trick of the light. This was real. The flowers had eyes, and they had been looking back at me. My scientific mind, my last bastion of sanity, was in full retreat. There was no logical explanation for this. It was an impossibility, a violation of every law of nature I had dedicated my life to understanding. I spent the night huddled by my fire, the negatives lying in the dirt where I had dropped them. I didn't sleep. I just stared into the flames, my mind a maelstrom of fear and disbelief. The forest was no longer a place of scientific wonder, it was a place of profound supernatural horror. The nightmare I'd had the night before came back to me with chilling clarity. The woman's face, her eyes the same as the flowers. Was she a ghost? A spirit of the forest? Or was she something else, something that had been planted here? The next morning, driven by a morbid curiosity that was stronger than my fear, I went back. I had to see the flowers again. I had to understand. I followed my own trail back down into the holler, my heart pounding with every step. When I reached the hemlock grove, the flowers were still there, a patch of pale, innocent white in the deep gloom. They looked exactly as they had before. Beautiful, serene, and utterly terrifyingly normal. I knelt, my hands shaking, and looked closely at the black center of one of the blooms. It was just a flower, a complex, velvety texture, but nothing more. There was no eye, no reflection, nothing. Was I going mad? Had I imagined it all? The photos, the dream? Was it all just a hallucination? A story my terrified mind had concocted? Then I saw the ground around the patch of flowers. The soil was disturbed as if it had been recently turned, and sticking out of the dark, loamy earth, almost completely buried, was a small silver locket. I dug it out of the dirt with my fingers. It was old and tarnished. I pried it open. Inside were two tiny faded photographs. One was of a young woman with a sad, gentle smile. The other was of a small child. And on the back, engraved in tiny, elegant script, were the words, Eliza and Lily, 1923. The locket was a cold, hard piece of reality in a world that had become a nightmare. This was a grave. The patch of flowers was a grave. And the flowers were growing from the people who were buried here. They were a living memorial, a botanical tombstone. And the eyes I had seen in the photographs, they were the eyes of the dead, staring out at the world through the petals of the strange parasitic blooms that fed on them. The full horror of it washed over me. The beauty of the flowers was a lie. It was a mask for a century of death and sorrow. How many others were there? How many other patches of these terrible, beautiful flowers were hidden in the deep, dark hollers of these mountains? I heard a sound behind me, a twig snapping. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. A woman was standing at the edge of the clearing. She was old, dressed in a simple dark dress, her hair a long white braid. It was the woman from my dream. She wasn't a ghost. She was real. Her face was a mask of ancient, sorrowful wrinkles, but her eyes were sharp and clear. She was holding a small trowel and a watering can. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice a low, whispery sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. "This is a private place, a place of remembrance. Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I am the gardener," she said simply. She gestured to the patch of white flowers. "I tend the blooms." She walked past me and knelt by the flowers, her movements slow and reverent. She began to gently cultivate the soil around their bases with her trowel. "They are beautiful, aren't they?" she said, not looking at me. "They are called sorrow blooms. They only grow in soil that has been consecrated, enriched by a great and terrible sadness. Each one is a life, a story, a memory." She looked up at me and her eyes were filled with a profound, ancient grief. "This is Eliza and her daughter, Lily. They were lost in a blizzard 100 years ago. I found them in the spring. I gave them a place to rest, a place to bloom." I stared at her, my mind struggling to comprehend. She wasn't a monster. She was a caretaker, a tender of a graveyard of flowers. You bury them? I stammered. I give them a home, she corrected gently. The lost ones, the forgotten ones, the ones this world has thrown away. The mountains bring them to me, I find them and I plant them, and they bloom, they become beautiful again. It is a kindness. Her words were spoken with such simple, profound conviction that for a moment I almost believed her. But then I remembered the eyes in the photographs, the silent, screaming terror in them. This wasn't a kindness. This was a prison. She was trapping their souls, their consciousness in these terrible, beautiful flowers. They are not at peace, I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of pity and horror. I saw them. In my pictures, I saw their eyes. They're trapped. The old woman's gentle expression hardened. The grief in her eyes was replaced by a cold, hard glint of anger. You saw what you were not meant to see, she said, her voice losing its whispery quality, becoming sharp and cold as ice. The blooms do not like to be seen. It disturbs their rest. She stood up, her small, frail frame suddenly seeming to possess an ancient, formidable strength. You have disturbed them. You have disturbed this place. You carry the scent of the outside world, the scent of doubt, of disbelief. You cannot stay. She took a step towards me and the air grew cold. The sweet, cloying smell of the flowers intensified, so thick it was almost suffocating. The soil is hungry, she whispered, and her voice was no longer her own. It was a chorus of voices, 100 whispers of sorrow and pain, all speaking at once. The blooms need feeding. A new story, a new sadness. I saw it then. This wasn't a graveyard. It was a garden, and she was always looking for new seeds to plant. I ran. I ran harder than I have ever run in my life. I crashed through the forest, the chorus of whispering voices chasing me, the sweet, rotten smell of the sorrow blooms clinging to me, filling my lungs, my head. I made it out. I don't know how. I stumbled onto the Blue Ridge Parkway, a raving, terrified madman. I was found by tourists who called the park rangers. I told them my story. I showed them the locket. I told them about the gardener and her terrible, beautiful flowers. They launched an investigation. They found the hemlock grove. They found the patch of disturbed earth, but the flowers were gone. The soil was just soil. The locket, they said, was probably just an old trinket lost by a hiker years ago. My photographs, the ones I had taken on film, were mysteriously overexposed, a milky white blur. My digital photos were corrupted, the files unreadable. There was no proof. My story was dismissed as the ravings of a man who had spent too much time alone in the woods, a story born of grief and isolation. I live in a city now. I have not been back to the mountains, but the mountains have not left me. The scent of the sorrow blooms is still with me. Sometimes I'll catch a whiff of it on the street, a phantom smell of sweet, cloying decay, and the terror comes rushing back. I see the eyes in my dreams, the eyes of Eliza and Lily and all the other lost souls, staring out at me from their floral prisons, their silent screams a constant chorus in the back of my mind. The gardener is still out there. Her garden is still growing, and she is always looking for new, rare specimens to add to her collection. So if you ever find yourself deep in the quiet, lonely woods of Appalachia, and you smell something sweet on the air, something like flowers on the verge of rot, I want you to remember my story. It's not a flower. It's not a dead animal. It's a warning. It's a claim. It means you have been chosen. Turn around, run, and pray you can outrun the bloom. Because once that scent gets inside you, it will never, ever let you go.